That thing's got more kick than you've got years left, old-timer, the young collector sneered, his voice slick with the unearned confidence of youth. Arthur Vance didn't flinch. He simply looked at the vintage Thompson submachine gun resting on a bed of black velvet, his gaze distant, as if seeing through the polished wood and cold steel into another time. The air, thick with the smell of gunpowder and gun oil, felt like a memory. "Just want to hold it," he said, his voice a low rasp, dry as autumn leaves. The collector, a young man named Kyle, whose tactical vest probably cost more than Arthur's monthly pension, let out a short, derisive laugh. "This isn't a museum piece for you to drool on. It's a serious machine for serious shooters." The range officer, a weary-looking man in his 40s, hesitated, but the condescension in the air was thick enough to choke on. They saw a frail old man with a cane, his flannel shirt faded and his hands marked by a faint tremor. They were about to learn that some hands never forget. If you believe respect is earned through a lifetime of quiet sacrifice, type honor in the comments below. Arthur Vance's day began not with an alarm clock, but with the quiet protest of his left knee, a dull ache that served as a more reliable timepiece than any Swiss-made watch. It was a souvenir from a lifetime ago, a permanent reminder of a muddy hillside halfway around the world. He was 83, and his body kept a meticulous ledger of his years. He rose slowly from the bed, his movements deliberate, and made his way to the small kitchen. The linoleum floor was cool beneath his bare feet. The house was silent, a stillness that had settled in a decade ago and never quite left. He made coffee in a percolator, the gurgling sound a familiar comfort, and sat at his small kitchen table, looking out the window at the rising sun painting the eastern sky in shades of pale orange and violet. His hands, resting on the worn Formica tabletop, had a slight persistent tremor. It was age, mostly, but not entirely. Sometimes in the quiet moments it was memory. After his coffee he pulled on a pair of sturdy work pants and the faded flannel shirt he'd had for 20 years. Its softness was an old friendship. His final preparation was the cane. It wasn't a medical device, not really. It was a simple, straight piece of oak, worn smooth by the grip of his palm over countless miles. He'd carved it himself from a fallen branch on his property years ago. It was a companion, a third leg that offered more stability to his thoughts than to his gait. Before leaving, he paused at a small table by the door. He picked up his wallet, a block of worn leather softened by decades of use. He opened it. Tucked behind his driver's license was a photograph, its corners soft, and its colors faded to a sepia dream. A young woman with a radiant smile, her hair styled in a way that had long since passed out of fashion. He traced the line of her cheek with his thumb, a silent conversation he had every single morning. Her name was Eleanor. He closed the wallet, the soft slap of leather a final punctuation, and placed it in his back pocket. His truck, a 20-year-old Ford Ranger, started with a familiar grumble. He drove with both hands on the wheel, his eyes scanning not just the road ahead, but the periphery, the ditches, the overpasses. It was a habit forged in a place where threats didn't announce themselves with traffic signals. Today was the annual Patriot Arms Collectors' Day, an event he hadn't attended in years. He wasn't sure why he was going now. Perhaps it was the date on the calendar, a quiet anniversary that no one else would remember. Or perhaps it was just a feeling, a need to connect with a part of himself he had long kept locked away. As he pulled into the sprawling parking lot of the gun range, he saw the crowds, the gleaming modern vehicles, the men in crisp new tactical gear. He felt like a relic himself, a faded photograph in a digital world. But what no one at that event knew, not the cocky collectors or the busy range officers, was that in less than 2 hours, a call would be made to a secure line in Washington, D.C., and the quiet dignity of this old man would become a matter of national importance. The range was a cathedral of controlled chaos. The sharp crack of pistol fire from the indoor bays echoed off the concrete walls, a staccato rhythm, punctuated by the deeper, throatier boom of rifles from the outdoor lanes. The air was a unique perfume of cordite, solvent, and hot metal, a smell that bypassed Arthur's nose and went straight to a dormant corner of his memory. Inside the main hall, long tables were draped in black cloth, showcasing firearms that spanned a century of innovation and conflict. Polished walnut stalks gleamed under the fluorescent lights next to matte black polymers. There were gleaming Colt Pythons, historical Lugers, and modern, heavily modified AR-15s with optics that looked more complex than a spaceship's dashboard. The crowd was a cross-section of Americana. There were fathers patiently explaining safety rules to their wide-eyed sons, groups of young men in matching tactical gear discussing ballistics with fervent authority, and older gentlemen in tweed jackets quietly admiring engraved shotguns. Arthur moved through it all like a ghost, his oak cane tapping a soft, steady beat on the polished concrete floor. He was an island of analog quiet in a digital sea of noise and bravado. He drew a few glances, a mixture of curiosity and dismissal. He was out of place, a sepia photograph in a high-definition world. His gaze wasn't on the modern weapons. It drifted over the historical tables, past the Mausers and the Enfields, until it settled on one particular display. At the center of the hall, a young man named Kyle held court. He was everything Arthur was not, loud, polished, and dripping with a manufactured confidence. His table was the most impressive, featuring a collection of pristine World War II-era American firearms, a bar, an M1 Garand, a 1911 pistol that looked like it had just left the factory, but the centerpiece, resting on a velvet-draped stand, was a Thompson M 1928A1, the iconic Chicago typewriter, its cuts, compensator, and finned barrel gleaming. Kyle was explaining its history to a small, rapt audience, his words practiced and smooth. "This isn't just a gun. It's a piece of history," he said, gesturing with a manicured hand. "The craftsmanship, the sheer American power. They don't make them like this anymore." David, the head range officer, stood nearby, keeping a watchful eye on the crowd. He was a man who had seen it all, the experts, the novices, the braggarts. His job was to ensure safety and keep the flow of traffic moving. He was professional but perpetually tired, his patience worn thin by the constant stream of egos he had to manage. He saw Arthur approaching Kyle's table and felt a familiar, preemptive pang of annoyance. Old-timers, in his experience, either had the best stories or the worst safety habits, with very little in between. 400 miles away, in a corner office overlooking the Potomac, a retired 4-star general named Marcus Thorne was looking at a framed photograph on his wall. It was a grainy black and white image of a young soldier in a jungle holding a Thompson, a ghost of a smile on his face despite the exhaustion in his eyes. The general's private phone, the one with the encrypted line, was about to ring, and that photograph would suddenly become the most important thing in his world. Arthur didn't join the small crowd listening to Kyle's lecture. He stood off to the side, his eyes fixed on the Thompson. He wasn't seeing the pristine collector's item under the bright lights. He was seeing it caked in mud, the stock scarred, the metal worn. He could almost feel the humid air, hear the buzz of insects, feel the familiar, comforting weight in his hands. He took in every detail, the placement of the selector switch, the vertical foregrip, the 50-round drum magazine attached below. He saw the subtle differences from the M1A1 model he had been more familiar with, but the soul of the weapon was the same. Kyle, finishing his speech, finally noticed the old man staring. He saw the faded shirt, the cane, the age-spotted hands, and an instinctual smirk touched his lips. It was the arrogance of a man who has read all the books, but has never had to live a single page. "Something I can help you with, Pops?" Kyle asked, his tone laced with a syrupy, condescending patience. He deliberately pitched his voice loud enough for his admirers to hear. Arthur's gaze slowly lifted from the gun to Kyle's face. His eyes, a pale, watery blue, were calm and unreadable. "It's a beautiful piece," Arthur said, his voice quiet. Kyle preened. "One of the finest examples in the country, all original parts. I spent a small fortune having it restored to factory-new condition." He ran a finger along the polished barrel, a gesture of ownership and superiority. "This is a model 1928, see?" Kyle continued, launching into another lecture, this time directed solely at Arthur, assuming total ignorance. The military version, the M1A1, simplified things. They got rid of the finned barrel and the compensator to speed up production. But this is the original artist's vision. Arthur just nodded slowly, his silence a blank canvas onto which Kyle could paint all of his assumptions. He wasn't being rude. He was simply listening, absorbing the young man's words, weighing them against the 60-year-old memories clamoring in his head. He remembered the feel of the trigger, the way the bolt slammed back and forth, the rhythmic buck of the gun against his shoulder. He remembered cleaning it meticulously in a sweltering tent, the smell of solvent mingling with the scent of canvas and damp earth. Kyle, mistaking Arthur's quiet reverence for senile confusion, pressed on. "The rate of fire is about 600 rounds per minute. It fires the point 45 CP round. Big, slow-moving bullet. Lots of stopping power." He spoke as if explaining primary colors to a child. A few of the younger men in Kyle's orbit chuckled softly. The old man was their entertainment, a harmless diversion before they went to send expensive rounds downrange. Arthur let the monologue wash over him. He had no interest in correcting the young man, in telling him that the true rate of fire was closer to 700, or that stopping power was a concept far more complex than bullet size. There was no point. Knowledge learned from a book and wisdom earned in blood were two different languages, and they were not mutually intelligible. After a long moment of just looking, Arthur took a half-step closer. The movement was small, but it shifted the energy of the interaction. He had been a passive observer. Now he was an active participant. He looked from the gun to Kyle, his pale blue eyes direct and steady. The tremor in his hands seemed to subside, replaced by a focused stillness. "May I?" he asked. The question was only 2 words, spoken in his quiet rasp, but it hung in the air with unexpected weight. It was a simple request to hold the weapon. To Kyle, it was an absurdity. The amusement on his face curdled into outright disbelief, then contempt. He let out a sharp, barking laugh that made several people turn their heads. You want to hold it? He repeated, drawing out the word as if it were the most ridiculous thing he had ever heard. He looked around at his friends, sharing the joke. This thing weighs 10 pounds, Pops, plus the drum. You might drop it. The insult was twofold, an attack on his age and his strength. It was designed to humiliate, to put the old man back in his place as a spectator. A small crowd, sensing drama, began to drift closer. They were flies drawn to the sugar of someone else's discomfort. Arthur's expression didn't change. His jaw tightened just a fraction, a subtle shift of muscle that was the only outward sign of his reaction. He didn't retract the question. He just waited, his silence a powerful counterpoint to Kyle's loud mockery. David, the range officer, saw the gathering crowd and knew he had to intervene. He walked over, placing himself between Arthur and the table, a human barrier. "Sir," he said, addressing Arthur with a tone of forced professional politeness. "It's a valuable collector's piece. The owner has a right to be protective. We have liability concerns." He was trying to be diplomatic, to de-escalate, but his words were a clear alignment with Kyle. He was managing a problem, and right now the old man was the problem. He was siding with the loud, confident member over the quiet, frail-looking stranger. It was the path of least resistance. "I understand," Arthur said, his voice still low, but with a new edge of steel in it. He looked at David, then back at Kyle. He wasn't pleading, he was stating a fact. He understood their position, but he did not accept it. The air grew thick with unspoken tension. The crowd was now fully invested, watching the quiet standoff between the arrogant collector, the weary official, and the silent old man with the oak cane. Kyle and David thought they had handled the situation, diffusing a minor annoyance with a dose of condescension and a sprinkle of policy. They were wrong. This wasn't the end of an interaction. It was the start of a reckoning that would change the very rules of their exclusive club. Arthur did not argue. He did not raise his voice or plead his case. With a slow, deliberate nod that acknowledged their decision without accepting its legitimacy, he stepped back from the table. He turned and walked away, the soft tap of his cane on the concrete marking his retreat. He found an empty metal bench against the far wall, away from the crowds and the noise, and sat down. He rested his cane against his leg and laced his gnarled fingers together in his lap. The cacophony of the range began to fade into a dull, distant roar. From the outside, he looked like a defeated old man, chastened and retreating into himself. But inside, a storm was raging. It wasn't anger, not the hot, quick-tempered anger of his youth. This was something colder, heavier. It was a profound and aching sadness. The disrespect from the young man was a sting, but the deeper wound was the dismissal, to be seen as nothing more than a collection of frailties. The wrinkled skin, the stooped shoulders, the trembling hands, was to have the entirety of his life erased. He looked at his hands. The tremor was back, more pronounced now. He remembered these same hands, steady and sure, field-stripping this very type of weapon in near-total darkness, the muscle memory so deep it felt instinctual. He remembered them gripping the foregrip, wrestling the gun's climb during a long burst, the hot brass casings ejecting in a golden arc. He remembered these hands writing a letter home on thin, crinkling airmail paper, the ink bleeding slightly in the humid air. A letter to Eleanor. He closed his eyes, and the gun range dissolved. He was 21 years old again. The air was thick and wet, tasting of chlorophyll and decay. The ever-present sound wasn't gunfire, but the chirping of insects and the distant chatter of monkeys. He could feel the weight of his pack, the chafe of the canvas straps on his shoulders, and the solid, reassuring presence of the Thompson slung across his chest. He remembered a promise he had made to Eleanor, whispered in the shadow of a train station platform before he left. "I'll come home," he had said. "I promise." And he had. But he hadn't come home whole. Parts of him were still buried over there, in the red soil of some forgotten hill whose name appeared on no map. The young man's words, "More kick than you've got years left," echoed in his mind. It was a flippant, cruel remark, but it struck a chord of bitter irony. He had outlived so many friends, boys who were all muscle and bravado, boys who had never had the chance to grow old and frail. He had been given the gift of years, and now those very years were being used as a weapon against him, a symbol of his irrelevance. He opened his eyes. The gun range swam back into focus. He was just an old man on a bench. The sadness began to recede, replaced by a quiet resolve. He hadn't come here for a fight. He hadn't come here seeking validation from boys who wore the uniform as a fashion statement. He had come to remember, and he would. A man in his late 60s, with a kind face and wearing a simple denim jacket, detached himself from the crowd and approached Arthur's bench. He'd witnessed the exchange with Kyle and had been put off by the young man's arrogance. "Don't mind him," the man said, gesturing with his chin back toward Kyle's table. "Some people think money buys class. It doesn't." He offered a hand. "Name's George." Arthur took the offered hand. His grip was surprisingly firm. "Arthur Vance," he replied. The name meant nothing to George, who simply nodded and sat on the other end of the bench. They spoke for a few minutes about the weather, about the price of ammunition, about the good old days. It was a simple, pleasant conversation, a small act of kindness in the wake of casual cruelty. But their conversation had an unintended witness. A young man named Liam, a college student working part-time for the event, was walking past with a stack of registration forms. He was a history major with a particular fascination for military history. He overheard the name, Arthur Vance. The name on its own was unremarkable, but in this context, an elderly man showing a profound interest in a World War II Thompson, it snagged on a thread of memory. He remembered a late-night research session, scrolling through digitized, recently declassified archives. He'd been reading about a small, brutal engagement during the Korean War, a desperate holding action on a desolate, unnamed peak. The article had mentioned a name. He pulled out his smartphone, his fingers flying across the screen. He typed in Arthur Vance and Thompson and Korea. The first few results were generic, but then he added the name of the battle he remembered, Hill 734. The screen refreshed. An article appeared from a niche military history journal. It was titled The Ghost of 734, The Story of Sergeant Vance. Liam's eyes widened as he read. His breath caught in his chest. He read about a platoon cut off, surrounded and overwhelmed. He read about a young sergeant who held the line for 17 hours with a Thompson submachine gun, single-handedly repelling multiple assaults after his commanding officer was killed. He read about a unique, controlled burst firing technique that had become a legend among the survivors of the campaign. He looked from the phone to the quiet old man sitting on the bench. It couldn't be. But the age matched. The quiet dignity matched. The deep, unspoken connection to that specific weapon. It all fit. His heart began to pound. He wasn't just looking at an old veteran. He was looking at a legend. Liam fumbled for his radio, his hand shaking. He found a quiet corner and called the event coordinator, who was also the range owner, a retired Marine colonel named Frank Peterson. "Frank," Liam whispered, his voice cracking with a mixture of awe and panic, "you need to get down to the main hall now. We have a guest. His name is Arthur Vance." As Liam stammered into the phone, his voice a mix of awe and panic, Arthur sat on the bench, unaware of the storm he had unleashed. The disrespect he'd just faced wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Kyle's dismissive tone was an echo of a young lieutenant's voice 50 years ago, just moments before a decision was made that cost good men their lives and earned Arthur the very legacy he now hid. Colonel Frank Peterson, USMC, retired, was in his office, buried in paperwork and lamenting his decision to host such a large event, when his radio crackled to life. He listened to the breathless, almost hysterical report from his young staffer, Liam. At first he was annoyed. "A guest? Liam, I have 100 guests out there. What's the problem?" "No, sir, you don't understand," Liam insisted. "It's Arthur Vance. The Arthur Vance, from Hill 734. Frank Peterson froze, the pen still in his hand. The name and the place name struck him like a physical blow. He wasn't just a gun enthusiast. He was a student of military history, a man who believed that the Corps was a brotherhood that transcended time. He knew the story of Hill 734. Every officer of his generation knew it. It was a hallowed piece of military lore, a story of impossible courage told in hushed, reverent tones at the War College. The official records were sparse, many details still classified, but the legend was potent. The ghost of 734, a single sergeant who had held back an entire company. Frank's face went pale. That a man of such stature was on his range, being treated like just another customer, or worse, being dismissed by some arrogant punk like Kyle, whom Frank had long tolerated for his money, but never for his character, was a profound failure on his part, a failure of respect. "Keep an eye on him, Liam. Don't let him leave," Frank commanded, his voice now tight with urgency. "And don't say a word to anyone." He hung up the radio and sat for a moment, his mind racing. This was above him. This required a level of respect he alone could not provide. There was only one person to call. He unlocked a drawer in his desk and pulled out a small, worn address book. He flipped through the pages until he found a number he hadn't dialed in nearly a decade. It was the private, secure line of his former commanding officer, a man who had gone on to become one of the most respected military leaders of his time, General Marcus Thorne. He dialed the number, his heart pounding a nervous rhythm against his ribs. The phone rang twice before it was answered by a deep, authoritative voice. "Thorne, General, it's Frank Peterson." There was a pause on the other end. "Frank, it's been a long time. Is everything all right?" "Yes, sir." "No, sir," Frank stammered. "General, you're not going to believe who just walked into my range." He took a deep breath. "It's Arthur Vance. Sergeant Major Vance. He's here." The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. Frank could hear the general's breathing, slow and controlled. He could picture the man in his D.C. office, his back ramrod straight, his mind processing the impossible news. For General Thorne, Arthur Vance wasn't just a legend from a history book. He had been a young lieutenant in that same campaign on a different part of the line. He'd listened to the desperate radio calls from Hill 734. He'd seen the aftermath. He had spent his entire career holding Sergeant Vance up as the epitome of the enlisted man, the bedrock upon which the entire military rested. "Is he all right?" Thorne's voice was low, taut with emotion. "He seems quiet, sir." There was an incident. A young collector was disrespectful. Frank felt a hot flush of shame. Thorne's next words were not a request. They were an order. "Keep him there, Frank. Don't let him leave. I'm on my way." The line went dead. Frank Peterson slowly placed the phone back in its cradle. He knew what "I'm on my way" meant. General Thorne lived 400 miles away. For him to say that meant traffic laws were about to become mere suggestions. While history was being summoned over the phone lines, Kyle was basking in the glow of his perceived victory. He had successfully defended his prized possession from the grubby hands of a nobody. He recounted the story to his friends, embellishing it with each telling. "Can you believe that old guy?" he said, laughing. "Trembling like a leaf. Probably thinks it's a B gun. He wanted to hold it. I almost told him to go find the VFW Hall." His sycophants laughed along with him, their camaraderie built on a foundation of shared arrogance. David, the range officer, overheard the mockery. A small, unpleasant knot formed in his stomach. He had done his job, followed protocol, but the sight of the old man walking away so quietly had bothered him. Kyle's continued derision felt cheap and cruel. David had a grandfather who had served, a quiet man who never spoke of the war, but whose eyes held a familiar, distant look. He saw a flicker of his grandfather in Arthur Vance, and it made him deeply uncomfortable with the part he had played. His thoughts were interrupted by the sharp, authoritative voice of the range owner. "David!" Frank Peterson had emerged from his office, his face grim, his eyes burning with an intensity David hadn't seen before. "Come with me." He led David away from the crowd, his stride purposeful. "The old man," Frank said, his voice low and urgent, "the one who wanted to see the Thompson. Find him. Apologize. And then you are going to let him shoot that goddamn gun." David was stunned. "Sir? But Kyle." "I don't give a damn about Kyle," Frank snapped, his voice a whip crack. "This comes from me. Let the man shoot. Anything he wants. On the house. Set him up on lane 1. Clear it, if you have to. Do you understand me?" The sheer force of the command left no room for argument. "Yes, sir," David said, his mind reeling. What could have possibly prompted such a complete reversal? He walked back toward Kyle's table, a sense of dread and confusion warring within him. He approached Kyle, who was still holding court. "Kyle," David said, his voice flat, "we're going to let the gentleman fire your weapon." Kyle's jaw dropped. "Your what?" "No, absolutely not. The liability. The owner insists," David cut him off. "It's happening." Kyle's face turned a blotchy red. He was being overruled, his authority publicly undermined. "This is ridiculous. I'm a paying member. I'm not letting some senile old fool handle my $60,000 firearm." But David simply stared him down, backed by the unassailable authority of the owner. Defeated and fuming, Kyle reluctantly unlocked the Thompson from its stand. He slammed a 20-round magazine into the well with unnecessary force. "Fine," he hissed. "But if he scratches it, the range is buying me a new one." David took the weapon and walked over to the bench where Arthur was still sitting. He felt a profound sense of shame as he approached. "Sir," he said, his voice humbled. "Mr. Vance, I apologize for my behavior earlier. We were wrong. The owner would like to invite you to fire this weapon as our guest." Arthur looked up, his expression unreadable. He looked at the Thompson in David's hands, then back at the range officer. After a long moment, he gave a single, slow nod. They handed Arthur the heavy weapon, a smirk still playing on Kyle's lips. They expected the old man to stumble, to barely lift it. what none of them knew, not Kyle, not David, not the half-dozen people watching, was that in exactly 7 minutes a black Escalade would screech into the parking lot, and the name Arthur Vance would no longer be a whisper, but a thunderclap. The moment David placed the Thompson in Arthur's hands, a change occurred. It was subtle at first, then undeniable. The persistent age-related tremor that had marked his hands vanished completely. It was as if the cold steel and worn wood had absorbed the shaking, grounding him. His fingers, gnarled with arthritis, wrapped around the pistol grip and vertical foregrip with an easy familiarity, as if they were molded for his grasp. The 10-pound weight of the weapon, which Kyle had insisted would be too much for him, settled into his arms not as a burden, but as a counterbalance. He didn't just hold the gun, he became one with it. His stooped shoulders straightened. His posture, which had been softened by age, became solid and rooted. He racked the bolt with a fluid, economical motion, not the violent, exaggerated slam of a movie hero, but the practiced, efficient action of a man who had done it thousands of times under unimaginable stress. The sound, a solid clack-clack, was crisp and authoritative in the noisy hall. David watched, his mouth slightly agape. He was a professional. He knew firearms. He could tell the difference between a man holding a tool and a man holding a part of himself. This was the latter. Kyle, standing nearby with his arms crossed, scoffed, trying to maintain his air of superiority, but a flicker of uncertainty entered his eyes. "Look at him," he muttered to one of his friends, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Thinks he's in a movie." Arthur ignored him. He was in his own world now, a world of muscle memory and sensory recall. He brought the stock to his shoulder, his cheek finding the wood in a perfect, instinctive weld. His stance was not the modern, aggressive isosceles or Weaver stance taught to every new shooter. It was something older, a classic crouch, feet planted like the roots of an oak tree, his body angled to absorb recoil. David frowned. He recognized that stance. It was right out of a 1940s field manual, a textbook illustration brought to life. Arthur flipped the selector switch from safe to full auto. The metallic click was audible even over the din of the range. He didn't need to look. His thumb knew the location by feel. David led him to lane 1, which had been cleared. He placed a fresh paper silhouette target at the 15-yard line. "Whenever you're ready, sir," David said, his voice now filled with a respect that had been absent just minutes before. The small crowd that had gathered was silent, their mockery replaced by a tense curiosity. They were about to see an old man make a fool of himself, or they were about to see something else entirely. Arthur leaned into the weapon. His breathing was slow and even. He didn't aim for the center mass of the target, the big, easy-to-hit X-ring. His eyes, clear and focused, settled on a point on the upper left shoulder of the silhouette. For a moment he was perfectly still. Then he squeezed the trigger. The Thompson roared to life. It was not the uncontrolled climbing spray of a novice. It was a burst so short, so disciplined, it sounded like a single stuttering cough. Brrrt. 3.45 caliber rounds punched through the paper in a group so tight they could be covered with a quarter. The recoil barely moved him. Before the echo of the first burst had faded, he fired again. Brrrt. Another perfect 3-round group appeared next to the first, forming the top of a neat triangle. He adjusted his aim slightly. Brrrt. A third burst completed the triangle on the target's shoulder. The entire range seemed to fall silent, the shooters in other lanes pausing to see what was happening. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. Then Arthur did something extraordinary. He began to walk the gun across the target. In a series of impossibly quick, controlled 2-round bursts, he stitched a perfect horizontal line from the left shoulder to the right. Bert, 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 Bert. Each burst was a masterpiece of trigger control and recoil management, a skill that took a lifetime to master and was impossible to fake. The neat line of holes across the paper was like a signature. It wasn't just shooting, it was communication. It was a language spoken in gunpowder and lead. David's jaw was on the floor. He had been a firearms instructor for 20 years. He had trained SWAT officers and competitive shooters. He had never, ever seen a display of full auto control like this. It was inhuman. It defied physics. Kyle stood frozen, his face a mask of pale, slack-jawed disbelief. The entire foundation of his expertise, his carefully constructed world of knowledge and superiority, had been demolished in less than 5 seconds. The weapon he had condescendingly called a serious machine for serious shooters was being wielded by this old man with a level of skill he couldn't even comprehend. At that exact moment, a man walked into the range from the main entrance. He was in his late 60s, dressed in a perfectly tailored dark suit, but he moved with the unmistakable posture of a career military officer. His presence was a gravity well. It pulled all attention towards him, silencing the remaining whispers. It was General Marcus Thorne. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at the range owner who hurried to greet him. His eyes went straight to Lane 1, to the old man with the Thompson, and then to the impossible pattern stitched across the paper target. A look of profound awe and emotion crossed the general's face. He spoke, and his voice, deep and resonant, boomed through the silenced range, carrying the weight of history. "The Vance stitch," Thorne said, his voice thick with a reverence that bordered on worship. "God help me, I never thought I'd see it again." Kyle stared, his face a mask of disbelief. "The what?" he stammered, the words barely a whisper. The general turned his gaze on him, and the temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. Thorne's eyes were like chips of granite. "That stitch," he said, his voice dangerously low, "is the signature that ended the siege of Hill 734, a signature that belongs to the only man who walked off that hill alive. You're not just looking at a shooter, son. You're looking at Sergeant Major Arthur Vance, recipient of the Distinguished Service Cross." The general's words landed with the force of a physical impact. Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military honor for valor. Hill 734, a name that was whispered in the halls of military academies. Sergeant Major, a rank that commanded universal instinctual respect. The identity of the quiet old man with the cane was laid bare, and the revelation was so staggering it left the room breathless. General Thorne strode past the stunned onlookers, his polished shoes clicking on the concrete. He walked directly to Arthur, ignoring everyone else as if they were merely furniture in the room. He stopped 3 feet in front of him. Then the 4-star general, a man who had advised presidents and commanded armies, snapped to the most rigid and perfect position of attention Arthur had ever seen. He raised his hand in a salute so sharp, so precise, it seemed to cut the air. It was not the perfunctory gesture of a superior officer. It was a salute of profound, heartfelt respect from one soldier to another. "Arthur," General Thorne said, his voice thick with an emotion that 60 years of military discipline could not entirely contain, "it is an honor, sir." The word "sir" from a 4-star general to a retired sergeant major, was the ultimate sign of deference. It inverted the entire military hierarchy, placing personal valor above rank. Arthur slowly, deliberately lowered the Thompson and placed it gently on the bench in the shooting stall. He turned to face the general. He looked at the crisp salute, at the unwavering eyes of the man before him. A flicker of a memory of another young officer, another salute on a dusty field long ago. Arthur did not salute back. He was a civilian now, and the gesture would have been improper. Instead, he simply gave a short, respectful nod. His eyes, for the first time that day, seemed to clear of the past, and he met the general's gaze directly. In that silent exchange, more was communicated than words ever could. Shared history, mutual respect, the unspoken bond of those who have seen the worst of humanity and endured. The moment was so powerful, so intensely personal, that everyone else felt like an intruder. Kyle's face had drained of all color. He looked as though he might be sick. The foundation of his world had not just cracked. It had been pulverized into dust. The man he had mocked, belittled, and dismissed as a frail, incompetent old fool was a hero of a stature he could barely comprehend. He had offered condescension to a legend. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on him, stealing the air from his lungs. David, the range officer, was the first to move. He stepped forward, his face a portrait of mortification. He stopped near the general, but his words were for Arthur. "Mr. Vance, Sergeant Major," he stammered, his voice choked. I am so sorry for my ignorance, for my disrespect. There is no excuse." He didn't try to offer one. He simply stood there, humbled and ashamed, offering the only thing he had left, a raw and honest apology. The rest of the crowd remained silent, their earlier amusement and curiosity replaced by a profound sense of awe and collective shame. They had been witnesses not just to a display of incredible skill, but to a moment of living history. The immediate aftermath was a series of quiet, respectful movements. Frank Peterson, the range owner, approached, his face etched with humility. He gestured toward the Thompson lying on the bench. "Sergeant Major," he said, his voice low, "that weapon is yours. Please, accept it as a gift. A small, inadequate apology from all of us." Arthur looked at the gun. For a moment he considered it, but then he shook his head gently. "It's a beautiful piece of history," he said, his voice regaining its quiet strength. "It belongs in a place where people can appreciate it for what it is." He glanced over at Kyle, who was trying to shrink into the wall. The glance contained no malice, no triumph. It was the neutral, assessing gaze of a man who had seen too much to waste energy on petty grudges. "Some things aren't meant to be owned," Arthur finished softly, "just respected." The words were a final, gentle lesson. Kyle couldn't meet his eyes. He mumbled something incoherent, and for the first time in his life seemed to have nothing to say. He just wanted to disappear. General Thorne put a hand on Arthur's shoulder, a gesture of camaraderie that bridged the decades. "It's good to see you, Art," he said, using a familiar nickname that spoke of a shared past. "It's been too long." "You too, Marcus," Arthur replied, a hint of a smile touching his lips. They began to speak in quieter tones, their conversation drifting to names and places that meant nothing to anyone else listening. They were two old soldiers, momentarily transported back in time, standing on the common ground of memory. Liam, the young history student who had made the call, watched from a distance, tears welling in his eyes. He had read about heroes in books, but he had never imagined he would meet one. To see history breathe and walk and command such profound respect was an experience that would change the course of his life. He knew now that history wasn't just dates and facts. It was the quiet dignity of a man on a bench, the unwavering loyalty of a friend, and the enduring power of a single, courageous act. Kyle thought the worst was over. A moment of public humiliation, a lesson learned. He couldn't have been more wrong. General Thorne was about to have a very quiet, very serious word with the range owner about the caliber of his clientele, and Kyle's exclusive membership was about to be the first casualty. Kyle was not allowed to pack up his own collection. Range staff did it for him, their movements efficient and cold, while Frank Peterson stood beside him. "Your membership is revoked, Kyle," Frank said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Effective immediately. The prorated remainder of your dues will be mailed to you." But Kyle started to protest, but Frank cut him off. "There are no buts. This is a place of respect. You violated that. You're no longer welcome here." Kyle left in a state of quiet humiliation, the scornful looks of the other members following him out the door. His expensive collection suddenly felt like a pile of meaningless, hollow toys. His departure was a minor footnote to the day's events. The real story was unfolding at a quiet table in the range's small cafe. General Thorne had insisted on buying Arthur lunch. They sat for hours, a pot of coffee between them, as the afternoon sun slanted through the windows. The initial stiffness of their reunion melted away, replaced by the easy rapport of men who had shared a defining chapter of their lives. They talked about the old days, about friends lost, about the strange and winding paths their lives had taken. Finally, Arthur reached into his back pocket and pulled out his worn leather wallet. He carefully extracted the faded photograph of Eleanor and slid it across the table. "This is why," Arthur said simply. "This is who I was fighting to get home to." General Thorne picked up the photo with a gentle reverence. He looked at the smiling young woman, frozen in time. "She was beautiful, Art," he said softly. "She passed 10 years ago," Arthur said, his voice quiet. "Today's our anniversary. I guess I just wanted to feel a little closer to the man she married, the man I was back then." The confession hung in the air, simple, profound, and heartbreakingly human. He hadn't come for vindication or to show off. He had come on a private pilgrimage, a journey into his own past, to honor a love that had been his anchor through the worst storms a man could face. David, the range officer, made a change that week. He started a new program at the range, Veterans Honor Day. Every Tuesday, veterans could shoot for free. He put out coffee and donuts and made a point of sitting with the older vets, not to offer advice, but simply to listen. He learned more about history, courage, and humility in those Tuesday morning coffee sessions than he had in 20 years as an instructor. He never forgot the lesson Arthur Vance taught him, that the quietest people often have the loudest histories. The story of what happened at the Patriot Arms Collectors' Day became a local legend, a tale told and retold with increasing embellishment. But the truth was simpler and more profound than any legend. It wasn't a story about guns or shooting prowess. It was a story about respect. It was a reminder that the measure of a person is not found in their age, their clothing, or the steadiness of their hands, but in the unseen weight of the life they have lived and the sacrifices they have made. The quiet heroes walk among us every day, their greatness hidden beneath faded flannel shirts and humble demeanors. All we have to do is look closer and listen better. That evening, Arthur Vance sat on his front porch in his favorite rocking chair, The sun was setting, bleeding colors across the horizon. In his hands was his simple oak cane. He was carefully wiping it down with an oilcloth, the same way he had once cleaned a rifle, his movements slow, methodical, and filled with a quiet reverence. His hands were steady. He looked up from his work, his gaze drifting toward the first stars beginning to appear in the twilight sky. A quiet, peaceful smile touched his lips. He hadn't gone to the range seeking applause or vindication. He had gone to remember his wife, to connect with a piece of his past on a day that belonged only to them. The world, it turned out, had needed the reminder more than he did. True heroes don't always wear uniforms. They are our fathers, our grandfathers, and our neighbors. Their stories etched not on monuments, but in the lines on their faces and the quiet dignity in their eyes. For more stories that honor the quiet heroes among us, and to ensure these legacies are never forgotten, subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue to share the tales that matter.